France has fallen. Protests sweep across the nation after a teenage boy was shot dead by police. The killing sparking outrage across the country.
And there's been this tension for many years between the police and, has to be said, particularly the North African community, and less so sort of Central African immigrants living in France. Now, they, of course, will say that in the banlieues that it's police racism, police brutality. I think there is probably an element of racism among a minority of police officers, and I stress minority. Broadly speaking, they do a very good job in very difficult circumstances. And another factor is that there is the French for 20 years, or certainly some commentators, have described these inner cities as the lost territories of France. So this is where a parallel society has grown up, dominated either by Islamists or drug lords, and they control these areas, and they don't like the police going in there. The police are a symbol of the Republic, and so this is more of a factor than any police brutality. The police are trying to do their job. They're not allowed to do their job, and there's a lawlessness that has grown up, particularly in Paris, but in other cities too, Toulouse in the south, Lyon in the east. So it's a very serious and grave crisis that's facing President Macron.
Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host teacher and socialist Andy Lipson, and right-wing teacher Jessica is not here with us today. She's out, and we hope to have her back again. We are online at what'sleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site in the episode notes. You can also find their personal social media handles as at Don Eduardo Abarca and on Instagram, and Jess's Twitter handle as jhomie89. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. What's a morning? Sorry, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, we normally record on Thursday evening, and post on Saturday, but I was in Columbia, Missouri, visiting my family, so Eduardo was kind enough to delay recording till Friday. Then Eduardo got busy on Friday, and I was kind enough to delay recording till Saturday morning. So here we are, Saturday morning.
Good morning. Which I think people can see the difference when it's because of the sun comes in two different ways for me. So they're different lights.
Yeah.
That's for viewers if anyone pays attention, but I don't think anyone does.
Right.
All right, let's do this. Topic for today's discussion, we will be discussing France, the riots on the street, all of the protests that are happening in France. I'm glad, Andy, you've wanted to do this discussion. I'm a bit slow this morning, so forgive me. I also have a lot of feelings around this topic, as I was trying to express to you over the phone as I was making my tea, and you didn't want me to have that discussion with you on the phone. As always, Andrew Lipson, Dr. Lipson wants to have these conversations online, recorded, get me canceled, get me. Let's do it then. France.
Hey, Eduardo, do you want me to try to do a little summary of me to describe, and you to fill in from there, or would you like to?
I mean, you can. Go ahead. Why don't you? Why don't you tell us?
I think you're going to be doing a lot of talking in the beginning, so maybe I can give a little bit, so I can give you a boost start, and you can tell me what I get wrong.
It would be very helpful, actually. That way I can just let go of what the timeline and chronological order of things, but I can just give my thoughts instead.
All right.
Thank
you. So why don't I start with some of the just basic details that I know. In late June, I don't know the exact date. I think it's like June 27th, June 20th.
The 30th of the 27th of June. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Mm-hmm. No, it's fine. Nahel Merzouk, a 17-year-old French person of Algerian and Moroccan descent, was shot and killed by the French police. And the initial story that came, now there was anger around that, but the initial story that came out around that by the French police and the French state was this guy, we tried to stop him. He wouldn't stop. He was actually driving his car towards us, and we had to shoot him to defend ourselves. And so Nahel was charged posthumously with, reckless drive, or, doing some stuff like breaking traffic laws, and then also voluntary homicide, voluntary manslaughter, or something like that, possibly trying to kill a police officer. And then later, video came out that completely showed that entire story was a lie. That basically had the cops on the side of the car. We don't exactly know what happened, but no one was in front of the car. The car was stopped. They were at the side window messing with Nahel, and there were two other people inside the car. One person was arrested. The other person apparently got away. I don't know who that person was. But so at some point during that thing, Nahel, it's either Nahel drove off, or one story has it that actually the cops were messing with him, so his foot got off the brake, or maybe even shot him already, so his foot went off the brake. But either way, the idea was that Nahel was driving away, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and they shot him in the process of doing that. And there was anger brewing already around this was the third murder done by a police officer in France this year. And there have been a number of them over the last several years. And so the anger was already there. And once it was revealed that what the state had said about this was a complete lie, what the cops had said about this was a complete lie, I think things really erupted. People have probably seen the scenes of fires everywhere and things like that. And it started in Nanterre. How do you pronounce the one province? Nanterre. But then went on to other regions as well of Paris. And most in regions that are, I think, called banlieues. Mm-hmm. Banlieues, which are like suburban projects, like high rise, but very poor areas. Where a lot of immigrants are housed, and a lot of the poor are housed, and a lot of young people are housed. And so these fires were raging, and all I can say is that while the discussion about these fires has been and I think it's true, small businesses, things like that have been targeted. The major target of most of this riot and rebellion have been police stations, have been municipal buildings, basically city buildings. Like a mayor's house was attacked, and also a prison the prison gates of one place were actually set on fire as towards a sort of a protest. Again, these are largely protests against the repressive and racist actions of the state. And I do agree, or I do believe that there are other people who are getting caught, or other things are getting burned, but by and large, this isn't, in my opinion, this isn't a right. At least the anger around it is rightfully directed and shown towards the French state, which is racist, which protects only the rich, and protects only the capitalists of France, as well as protects the capitalists of the United States if they need to. And so I want to talk about this because I also think it comes in only months after a massive pension revolt took place that was also put down. And I want to say that this rebellion has gone on for about 8 days and has been now largely put down. There was up to 45,000 cops were in the streets per day for a while, and thousands of arrests. I guess there's other things like Snapchat and TikTok have been censored so that the people can't post things that are happening during this rebellion. And there's other stuff, but I'll start there and just say those are some of the basics. And I really wanted to see what you thought about it. And I knew you'd have some interesting things to say about it, both as France being your kind of almost a home for you, a second home for you, but also this is an area that you've often wanted to talk about both politically, because you feel it is such an important area of potential struggle. So I wanted to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah. For me, this was as I was listening to you, I'm going just to fill in a few little things here and there. It's like, just like in 2017, Macron had promised that he would have sweeping reforms to aid the banlieue, the suburbs of France, and those northern suburbs, Nanterre, Aulnay-sous-Bois. Those are the kind of places that have been, for the longest time, for the past 20 years, has seen an increase of demographic changes in France. A lot of people who I remember being in Idaho, and people would say things like, "Oh, France is very white." Well, I don't know, because it's a lot of immigrants. There are a lot of Northern Africans and a lot of Arabs, and and it's slowly even changing after 2015 with the rise of more immigrants coming. So back to Macron, he had promised that he would have those reforms to aid those suburbs. That quickly watered down. He had watered down the package, and in the last 6 years, little has changed. The other thing I just wanted to add was that those protests have really divided the country, because as I was speaking to some friends that I had been hosted, some friends from years ago that I'd stayed with, the issue around the officer and what he was doing, and it's reached an inflection point. But there's also this piece where I think it's largely ignored in the media. There is funding going to 1.5 million euros that are being gathered to help to support the police officer. So clearly the country is divided, mm-hmm. and I have seen Macron's position change from, "Oh, this is the police's fault," and then suddenly the police reacting to this, and then suddenly saying, "Oh, this is the parents' fault," or social media, or video games. Suddenly it's needing to change that, who's placing the blame on who. So I've just seen those changes, and also the changes in the people who are protesting, because it's interesting in France. You have what I guess we would say right wingers for the Yellow Vest movement, and then you have leftists rising, and then you have it keeps going. It just keeps moving, but they're all kind of together, but then they're not together. And then you have, for example, if we just go back even in the timeline, if you have just the protests in 2019, when I was there, and way before that, the Yellow Vest movement, we covered here in What's Left, and then the protests that happened against COVID, which united the left and the right over there in France, because largely all of the out of all the countries in Europe, France was with the most hesitancy and resistance to the COVID jab and any lockdowns. And then you have the pension reform, as you mentioned, and then now this. So it's like you have these changing left and right political spectrum of differences. So that's all I was going to add to that. As I told you over the phone, I've realized a few things. There are some reflections I've had after speaking to two friends. One of them, I can mention their name, Alex, a dear friend of mine. Maybe we'll do an interview with her if she is. I don't know. We'll see. I sometimes feel very insecure about my French with her because she speaks very fast. And she's a documentary filmmaker.
Et c'est dans le cadre de ce Master 2 que j'ai réalisé mon premier long métrage documentaire qui s'appelle Moudjahidat, sur des engagements de femmes dans la guerre de libération d'Algérie au sein du FLN à Hélène.
I met her at the 2019 protests when there were reforms being made to the unions, and transport was being stopped, and the metro did not work, and we were all walking in France. I was there. I don't know if I covered France from there, but I remember just talking to you, and I remember being there for some time and loving joining the protest there. And then suddenly COVID happened, and I had to return in January. But there in 2020 is when I returned. But there are different things that I'm hearing from different French folk. And as I was thinking, this is being compared to Black Lives Matter, and whereas
or George Floyd and things like that.
Right.
On George Floyd.
Yes, and I'm not sure how much people know, but this is like in the USA, you have a lot of statistics around race, and in France, there's not a lot of uh, political statistics on like how do you measure what's happening in other parts, because pretty much everyone is a French citizen; they're considered French citizens, and that's one way of not allowing people to discriminate. But of course, there's always happening stuff in those suburbs, and I I I I I have the way that I see it is I sometimes feel, maybe as I was telling you on the phone, going to school here in the USA and raised in this country, sometimes I wonder where the identity politics started for me as a person of color, being a brown person. And I realize some of it may have started, a lot of it actually, not some of it, in high school, at John O'Connell High School, where you have a sort of context about how you understand the world. And in SF, especially with liberal politics, then you're like taught about how Black and brown people are being shot and also marginalized. And I get that. Everything, there's a lot of stuff that I agree with. But when I'm in France, there's a different, being Mexican, I have a different experience. I don't feel, and I've said this, I think, before, I don't feel that level of scrutiny or racism that I've seen in the USA towards me. Even with my accent immediately gives me away as being someone that's not Arab or not Afro-French. And that experience has also shaped the way that I see it. And I can be in other areas and listen to French people who live in rural areas or small towns. And I'm told stuff that I don't think they would share with other people. Like, I remember being with my host family, and they clearly told me, they said, they do fear that the French people are going to disappear because there's so many immigrants and they're having so many more children than the French. Notoriously, French don't have a lot of children. They have one or two, very limited. And that is something that I remember thinking about, like, oh, right, they slowly the demographics are changing. But then I have Alex and my other friend Nicolas say, well, that's just the nature of anything. Migration changes people's color, people's like, you're just going to have those changes. We're all not, what are we we're originally all, come from different places. We're not going to stick to the same, we're going to change. We're all a mix of blood anyhow. So it's not a threat to other French, but the way the French life is changing is a threat to others. And I do see those changes since I've been an adolescent, going to France, and then now in my 30s, being in France, completely different after 2015, especially. I was there in 2004, right? I think, yeah, 2004, yeah. And then going back in 2015, well, not like I've been on and off going back and forth, but 2015 is so pivotal because that's when all of these boat of immigrants were being documented in the news, and a high rise of Syrians coming into Europe. And I think that's when I saw, whoa, the restaurants and chains and the metro being different, and just so many more people, and the French feeling resentful but staying quiet about it. They don't want to be labeled racist. They're seen as very welcoming, but a lot of them had whispers of, this is too much. How much can we bear having more people come? We can't save everyone. And they're changing the way of the French life. And those were difficult conversations to hear. And so, anyhow, this is coming up for me as I'm thinking about this. And when I stayed in Aulnay-sous-Bois, I stayed in a suburb that was in a high-rise building. I remember at the top, I would be staying. It wasn't a very safe place, but I had to run the stairs down because the lift would not work. So there were a lot of things that I would see, sketchy things on the way down from the stairs. And I was different there. And I remember the police stopped me once and said, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" And they thought I was coming there to buy drugs, to get something from there when I'm not from there. They clearly saw that I was not from there. And I was afraid. And I'll just say one more thing. When I was in those suburbs, I realized that those suburbs are largely controlled or managed by the people of those of northern African regions. They don't really allow, or they have a very strong dislike for allowing people to come into those suburbs. So, for example, when we would go to what I would consider to be like a flea market, which was an open air market, they were run by everyone that was immigrant, everyone who is kind of very chaotic the way that's run. It reminded me of being in Mexico, where you have these street booths, and people just sold things chaotically, and police presence is very disliked. So entering these spaces that, yes, sometimes gangs are run, and I will say even the membership of those gangs have exploded during COVID, when school closures and lockdowns meant that youngsters went without support and into the life of gangs. You see that in Marseille and in Paris, especially during school holidays that have turned into bloodletting seasons as teenagers turn to violence. Sometimes, everything has backfired since COVID, right? We have seen even the rise of tremendous psychological impact here in the USA as well, with school closures and everything that we're dealing with, the aftermath of the lockdowns. So I would blame that largely to governments. I wouldn't say that so much because of people. That's because, you have teenagers and you don't have places to go. Kids don't, sometimes in this capitalist world, parents are constantly working, trying to figure out a way to make a living, and you have adolescents out on the street running around, and you have gangs that suddenly taking advantage of that. But these suburbs that are run sometimes collectively, sometimes not in the best way, are a place of where people would say that this is festering. And Aulnay-sous-Bois, where I stayed, that was one of those places. And I stayed with someone who was of Arab descent, and another person who was of African descent, of Western African descent. And it was a very interesting experience for me to be there. Back to this politically, what amazes me, and maybe some people might see the connection, I certainly do, is from Yellow Vest movement to 2023, these protests and what people have bought into Macron's, because some people on the left might see Macron as being the alternative to Le Pen, and who is the right winger in the USA, I guess I would just say, like, Trump woman of France, right? Like, just to give people sort of an understanding. And the rise of protests, and then suddenly the shivering down of it, and then rise of it. It's like these waves, and the dislike for Macron and the hatred both on the left and the right. But he keeps being elected by his middle class and mostly elite class as the alternative to Le Pen, and yet I think sometimes the left falls into a trap. Although, as I said to you on the phone, there is the voting in the suburbs of Paris is not very high. So it's obviously not that they don't fall. The immigrant population does not fall into this trap, but a lot of people do. They think of the better of two evils. Sometimes this is, even though there are many different parties there that you can vote for, those two dominating figures, Macron and Le Pen, are the ones who are seen as to run electoral politics there. And a lot of leftists will just run to Macron as the alternative to Le Pen, right? what I think we can learn from. Oh, before we go there, I don't know if you want to say anything to anything I have said.
Yeah, I mean, first off, state repression is not a U.S. thing; it's a capitalist thing. So and it's a result of the fact that capitalism represents the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie globally, and we experience it through our own state. We have illusions in the United States, and apparently the French have the same illusions, that they live under a democracy, but you don't. You live under a tyranny. You live under a dictatorship, and that democracy goes away the minute you challenge it. And it is interesting that you raised. There's a number of things I want to say. That you raised the idea that the French society, the French working class, in many ways, is being divided again to one side who may celebrate this rebellion and see it as justified. Another side saying these Muslims, these Northern Africans are not. They haven't accepted French society. They haven't accepted French norms. They haven't accepted French democracy, and the state has to do something to and we've tried to give these people money. They don't know what to do with it. And so, now we have to, if they're not going to accept carrots, then apparently they're going to have to take some sticks. So that kind of division where the issue of immigration is being used and is being used very, very successfully, I would say, to divide workers in France, just as it is being used currently to divide workers in the United States. Because as people know, as we enter this election, the issue of immigration keeps coming up as a talking point, seemingly to divide Democrats and Republicans, but it's not. It's just to divide workers, and it's to use racism to separate us. Because the notion that the French state is there to help French workers is an illusion. The French state is an existence of tyranny to actually enforce rule over workers, exploit workers, and then use whatever exploitation, that surplus value, extract for them to grab more resources abroad. And does the French act as an empire? Yes. In fact, it acted as an empire in Algeria and Northern Africa, and it acted even in Syria. So the French Empire, even though it wasn't the major player in that region, in Libya, in Syria, and even in Tunisia, we certainly know that as part of the West, they have supported imperial invasions of those countries that have destroyed those countries and therefore led to, again, migrations that then people say, oh, hey, we can't accept all these people. Well, don't destroy their country then. How about that? How about stop doing that? So the notion that I think there's a lot of illusions that people have both in this country and that from the left to the right, that somehow there's something unique about the United States and its racism. It's nothing unique. It's replicated across the globe. If you go to Japan, you better not be a Korean. Maybe a black person isn't going to face the music in Japan, but if you're Korean, you're going to be treated like a second-class citizen. So racism is an aspect. It's a part of capitalism, and it's used to divide workers, and that's no different in France than it is whether a person experiences or not. Because, Eduardo, I haven't experienced racism in terms of being white in this country, but I certainly can see evidence of its existence when I look at our prison system, when I look at how divided the societies are, when I look at the actual living circumstances of many of the students I teach. Like, are they there because of their abilities? No, they're there because of something systemic taking place in our society. And it's a similar thing with these banlieues. And interestingly enough, the very freedom movement that I would have said that rejected passports as a means of getting into Starbucks or getting a job suddenly embraces the idea of passports as it relates to not suddenly, but embraces the idea of passports as it relates to maintaining national boundaries. And that doesn't help us. That just like passports internally are a control mechanism for the capitalists, national passport systems are control mechanisms of the capitalist class that we have to reject completely. And if we don't reject them, that will be used against us. And it's interesting to me that these banlieues have been described as places that seem to be autonomous. Like, that's when I was reading some of this. Like, and sometimes they talk about it in terms of gangs, which really, if you want to come down to it, gangs are just self-organized people. I'm not saying it's the self-organization of the working class, but that's what gangs are. They are organizations that the state doesn't have control of, And I would contend that the biggest reasons gangs are a threat has nothing to do with crime, has nothing to do with selling drugs or giving drugs. It's because they're independent of the state. And the state wants to have the right to come in and control everything. And so it's not just the 10% gang population that's a threat in these banlieues. It's the fact that actually they are often run as pseudo-separate entities, a situation that freedom people across the globe should actually celebrate, because we are actually trying to reproduce that exact same thing. Like what we are attempting to do here in the United States, when we talk about trying to solve some of the problems, we talk about, exit and build, right? Mm-hmm. And what are these things in banlieues other than people who they haven't quite exited, but they have built, and they've built something independent. And I think for that reason, it's a threat to the state. And so I'm not surprised that the state is coming in and using this issue the state was very threatened by the pension problem, the pension reform movement just only months ago. Well, now they've pulled off an interesting trick in the context of this rebellion. They've gotten a section of those people who hated Macron a second ago, now asking for Macron to come in and use the state to crack down on them. So again, these are all antithetical to what I would say are the values of the freedom movement, not the rebellion, but the state crackdown against the rebellion. And I would include that's the state crackdown as not just being TikTok and Snapchat being censored, but you mentioned the 1.3 million that's being raised for that police officer. Well, guess what? That money is being taken off, apparently, just like when we did the Give, Send, Go thing for the Canadian truckers. They're doing the same thing to the people who are trying to raise money for that police officer. The state is coming in and saying, no, you can't put money to that, right? And to me, again, those are the dangerous things. The dangerous thing to me is not whether they lit police cars on fire, and I don't celebrate the idea that there's collateral damage, and there will be collateral damage. And I guess I'll put it in terms of this way: when this happened with this guy with Nahel, if nothing had happened, would I have celebrated that? No. If a police shot Nahel wrongly and then nothing happened, I would not have celebrated that. Once police shot Nahel, if there were just like protests on Saturday and Sunday and people were marching in a line and just like saying, we don't agree with this, would I have celebrated that compared to what I see here? No, I actually think what I see here, what I celebrate in what's taking place here is the fact that what is shown is the desire for people for something else, and the willingness of people to take on the state in order to possibly get something else, in order to make a different world possible for themselves. What is sad is that these very same things that took place now in 2023 are an exact replica of what took place in 2005 in France, when there was a killing, there were police killings I think it's in the banlieues again, and exactly the same thing. Between 2005 and 2023, there has not been any political organization of the working class to allow to take the fire of the desire for change and turn it into something that could actually threaten the French state. Because the French state is going to take advantage of this. They're going to take advantage of the fact that people there is anti-immigrant sentiment in France. There is nationalism in France. And I'm not talking about Le Pen. I'm talking about liberals. I'm talking about leftists. There are leftists who supported the hijab ban in France because that because that was like backwards. So like I'm not making a left-right distinction. I'm making a revolution versus reform distinction. And I'm going to say this. I believe there are very, 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 very few revolutionaries in Russia, just like there are in France, just like there are very, very, very few revolutionaries in the United States. There's no more revolutionaries in France than there are in the United States, because most people at this point find themselves wringing their hands and getting upset about what got burned, rather than saying, why the fuck have we not been able to organize the working class to take the fire that these immigrants are showing that we need to have in our own hearts for taking down the system and replacing it with something else? How have we not, in the 20 years since the last time France burned, not gotten any better at making that burning happen more productively? Why is it the same old unproductive burning that only shows us the anger, but doesn't show us the instinct for actually changing society. And instead is going to be utilized to, again, pit people against each other. And Macron can kind of survive by saying, oh, you didn't like me around the pension reform? Well, give me state power to smash on TikTok, smash on Snapchat, smash on immigrants. Let me actually start to collect data on immigrants and collect data on people of color and surveil them in the ways that they are doing in the United States, and justify that. Like, oh, we'll call it a census, but really what it is data collection. So I think the state is getting over again. And like I said, the House always wins, apparently. And that, to me, is what is sad about this moment, and what is tragic about it. I don't think it's tragic. I certainly don't think it's tragic that municipal buildings are being burned or that police cars are being burned. I think it's unfortunate that because there's no organized expression for this anger to take place, that there is collateral damage that will then be used to smear immigrants and to smear these young people who are fighting back against the system, essentially. Even if they don't see it that way, that's what I see it as. But this fight back will not be able to challenge the system because it has no political coherence, and it has not developed that political coherence from 2005 to 2023. To me, that's the biggest tragedy. But that's not just a problem in France. That is a problem globally. Except maybe I could say India. India, it seemed, had more coherent movement of the farmers' movement taking on capital and things like that, even if itself, that also got pushed aside as well.
Yeah, a few things I'd like to, glad you speak, because then I have some thoughts that come up for me. Well, one, you're right about data collection. In Odysee, like in many other suburbs, there's now free connectivity to the internet. That is data collection. You have so many people there who are, like I said, those are mostly low income and people who normally just cannot afford living in Paris, but mostly immigrants, and high data collection because of free internet access. You can connect there, and they have set up so much wireless internet connectivity there, which I would love to see an Alison McDowell sort of investigation into that, how much of it's being tracked. And around these societies, like these parallel societies, these are what are considered as the lost territories of France, because they are being run by what people would say in the news lawlessness, or Islamists, or drug lords, or anarchists. There's anarchy in these in these suburbs, which are being developed as alongside elite French societies. You have clearly Paris, which is a very rich city, and then you have around Paris all these very poor areas. And
I hope you see, I mean, I think you see, Eduardo, the contradiction for people who say they're in the freedom movement, supporting the state coming down and cracking down on that kind of self-organization, right? You see the contradiction there, right? Like it's complete hypocrisy, and it's hypocrisy, and it's tragic that people do not see the very same people who have this instinct for building their own thing and who see the right of people to be armed in doing so, suddenly can't see it when it's in it with a Muslim face.
Right. I mean, yes, I do see. Yes, I think obviously we have filters in the way that we see. Yes, I see that. Not like I'm defending or anything. I don't want it to come off that way. But the question remains for some of the people who are out on the streets protesting. One of the things that they say is, so I was speaking to Alex and a friend, and they say, one thing we're going to have to learn to do together to be able to organize in a more effective way is we're going to have to really, because there are, like I said, so many, there's a diverse set of people that are on the streets. So the Yellow Vest movement, mostly by rural and working class French folk, not of recent immigrant descent, if I just to say it that way, because I think we're kind of all have different descents, but like of recent immigrant descent, they just do not like the immigrants, and they're out on the streets. And then there are the people who are on the left who are very revolutionary, as they would say, but their struggle with working with immigrants is like the way that women are being treated on the streets. So it's the social norms of knowing how to work together because of differences in culture and learning how to work out those differences, because that's how this is. There are these divisions. The women on the streets want to support Nahel and all of their family and everyone, like Alex, who has gone to Palestine. But the struggle around the way that they're being treated as well as women, or people who are gay, for example, and viewed differently because of Muslim traditions. These things we're going to have to contend with the differences as working class folk and how to work together. And also inviting some of those people on the right, I mean, the French would say that they've always been difficult to integrate, as you mentioned. But that is something that, as we have learned here, and knowing how to build something with people, we're going to have to figure out a way to work together.
So first off, I love this word integration, because that's not what if anybody who thought they were a leftist thought this was about integration, and all that is racism with a big word, covered under a big word. Because what we're talking about is collaboration. We're talking about working together. And we're talking about, cross-cultural, cross-gender, cross-sexual orientation collaboration. And when I don't want to talk about the right-wingers, I want to talk about these leftists. I want to talk about these leftists who say, I would love to work with these people, but they're sexism. I don't know if I can deal with it. Look what Max, what's his name from our struggle in Thacker Pass, Max Wilbert, right? Max Wilbert is working with people who think women might not have the right to vote. He's working with them to help them because they're united in trying to save that land for different reasons. That person who's doing that might not think the women have the right to vote, might not even think the Fourth Industrial Revolution is such a bad thing, but maybe no, I don't want this land taken away because I use it. I don't want to be taken by the state. Max has a completely different reason for engaging in that struggle, but his starting point is, I'm going to join you in that struggle, and I'm going to join you in a struggle against state intervention and corporate intervention. That's the starting point for the left here. The starting point for the left needs to be, I'm not going to let the state come in and strangle you. All right? Then you can talk to people about sexism. But first you get in and you say, I'm not going to let the state, because much mischief has happened when the left has accepted, these Taliban, they're sexist, so maybe the U.S. has to come in or has to come in and impose a democracy so women can be better running, or women can have better lives in Afghanistan. That's a complete illusion, right? A complete illusion. Sexism is, I'm going to say it, sexism is a global capitalist problem and is just as pronounced. It takes a different aspect, takes different forms, is just as pronounced in the United States as it is in France, as it is in Afghanistan, as it is anywhere. It finds itself a different expression, but women are going to find themselves in a worse situation everywhere across the globe in some way, shape, or form, because sexism is a tool of capitalism, just like racism is a tool of capitalism, even if its aspect, even if who experiences the racism or how sexism is experienced is different. And so that illusion that so-called leftists like to have, that, we're less sexist, so you got to figure your sexism thing out before I can kind of figure out working with you. That is just another bullshit division point. Without them saying it, they're basically saying, I trust the French state more than I trust my Algerian or Moroccan brothers and sisters. Sorry, that has zero revolutionary content, and all it had, it's leftist content under that, over it is leftist content, but hidden underneath it is a deep conservative worker divide ideology. And so I can't help that people can't see through their own bullshit. But that's why I want to talk about the left, not the conservatives. It's unfortunate that the conservatives also fall for the same trap that most of the left falls for. But it's a tragedy that when you go from left to right, everyone's falling for this trap. And we're falling for it again, because people have a psychological discomfort of hearing about Muslims, people with Islam, lighting shit on fire, because they already bought the racist bullshit around the war on terror that said that Muslims and people in Islam are more violent, right? When those people's countries have been destroyed through generations of U.S., British, Western imperialism, and that largely their response is to that violence, and to what extent we see violence from them is completely in response to the violence that's been imposed on them. And our job has always been to just do one thing: take out our own government, take out our own state in the face of that. Do not let our state run roughshod over the globe, and don't let it run roughshod over people in this country, whether it be George Floyd or immigrants or workers in the SEIU and the hotel union who are getting screwed here in San Francisco, and they're basically dividing Asian immigrants versus Latino immigrants by shipping in undocumented Latino workers to push out Asian workers who work there. It's like, look, this is age-old tricks the capitalists use, and they do it. It works. The tragedy is we keep falling for it. And the one side that was supposed to expose this, the so-called left itself, has absolutely no understanding of it, in my opinion. And yet they praise themselves for being for women, for being for gays, for being for transgenders. And yet they're for nothing. They're for nothing other than maintaining the capitalist state. That's it.
And I would say I would say the difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and then the French is, the stark difference is that BLM has been co-opted and has been taken over by politicians, and it's not in France. This isn't some movement that is. There are over like 200 mayors that just went over and met with Macron, and they were like, "You need to declare a state of emergency." This isn't something that is being by the left or right being accepted, and so the difference is in BLM, you'll hear even Nancy Pelosi supporting it, or Hillary Clinton, or something like that, right? And they'll start co-opting this and talk about how we need more representation and more identity politics, more people of color in office. This is the kind of conversation that leads from BLM, which is my criticism with it, right? Whereas in France, though, with this, they're not speaking about more politicians in office. I wanted to, just before I forget, Andy, there is a film called La Haine, which is the hate, and it really shows, if anyone wants to sort of get an understanding of what it's like, it follows the story of 3 friends in the suburbs in Paris, outside of Paris, and it gives just a view of what it's like out there in these growing up of immigrant descent and of Northern African and Arab descent. And I just wanted to put it out there if I forget. And they're not at all they don't see it as a way out. Will liberal leftists think similar? I think not. They're on the streets, but for a different party. And so that's where I think that's the trap for other people joining these protests. It's like they're there, but they're showing up. And even when the call for these people, mayors, are saying, let's do a counter protest before more peaceful, that's when I saw that is like trying to manage damage control this whole situation. And suddenly you have liberals out on the streets saying, yes, we support Nahel and his family, but let's call for a more peaceful protest, and supporting alternative parties other than Le Pen or Macron, which is the difference in the way that these young folk and the people of Arab descent are protesting from the more liberal protests that are calling for peace. And even trying to have Nahel's grandmother, I think, under duress, really, because she didn't say anything about this in the beginning until recently. She's like, okay, let's have peace. Let's do this. But I can see how the pressure on her, because this is her grandchild, to say something like that and to call for peace didn't work. But she being used as a pawn by officials and stuff, like the mayors that I mentioned, going up and calling for emergency state, which is basically what the government is going to be doing if this continues. I don't know what the sentiment is at this moment, if they're going to continue or if it's going to shimmer down. I hope not. I hope something comes out of this. As always, as you were mentioning, though, that we have a big working class or not demonstration, a big working class uniting front issue, and that's the issue that we're facing globally. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see if some remnant stays, even just to continue the discussion and continue and make some guerrilla forces. I've always would like to see something happening like that in Western societies or more Northern Hemisphere countries, because even though, my criticisms around Zapatista movement, at least they're right there with the little emblem of flame, trying to keep something, or hopefully something will spark something there. But I hardly see something like that happening in the USA or in France, where you have a small guerrilla force like that.
Yeah, for me,
largely to gun control too. I don't think you'll have some guerrilla force when you have a society where there's a lot of gun control, and France is very well known for the gun control.
Yeah, and I don't want to sit here also and I do think that, first of all, there's been a political stance. As much as I celebrate this rebellion, and I do, and I think it should warm people's hearts that there is this much anger out there that's prepared to tear down the existing system. The tragedy is there isn't the level of organization to actually replace it with something that's better, and to resist politically and resist organizationally the way the state will come in when this thing, as this thing moves, to tear it apart and divide and conquer it. So that situation has not developed any better from 2005 to 2023, and so I do believe that there will be a co-optation of this. It will. Arab Lives Matter will come. Islamic Lives Matters. There's going to be a version of that's going to co-opt a section of the anger among those, and there's going to be some Moroccan young person or Algerian young person who's going to be swept up into the political apparatus, a left political apparatus, and used as a representation tool to say we're helping these people, but we're using the powers of the state to do so, when that's the opposite. So things never just stand still. If you are not figuring out how to defeat your opponents, then you are being defeated, and that's what's happening right now. Like the fact that this rebellion was tapped down in 8 days, the fact that the state itself has already secured for itself so many new platforms for repression, not just including the TikTok and the Snapchat, but I think the fact that they were able to freeze the assets, or freeze the not assets, freeze the money that was being raised for that police officer. That's a big step forward for the French state, because they did it on the right, and so we did it on the right, and I'm sure the left is celebrating that, and the left is an idiot, because they're going to have that same state's going to come back on them and use that against them if they ever do anything independent. So the reality is that these moments are moments when people in the Yellow Vest movement could have joined with this rebellion and figured out, okay, how do I be a part of this? How do I work with this? Because we are no more happy with this system than they are, but yet we have different experience of it, and maybe different beefs with different sides, but it's the same system. Now, because people don't see it that way, that kind of unity is not going to happen just of its own. I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's going to have to happen. And it's certainly not going to happen by somebody saying, well, until you figure out this talking point or this talking point, or you become better on gay rights or women's rights, then I'm not sure I can deal with you. That's never going to work. It's going to have to be, like, I believe that Max is onto something when he understands, well, in working with people who have different ideas, this is going to be part of how we're going to work through our different ideas. It's going to start from me saying, I'm with you on your cause, and I want to help you with it, because it's the same cause as I have. So that's where the left is going to have to learn something. And I don't even want to talk about the left. That's where the revolutionary movement is going to come, because I'm sick of the left.
Yes. Okay, Andy, I'm not sure if you want to find a way to conclude. Should we find a way to conclude?
Well, I'll say this. You had some questions for yourself and for maybe me in the phone conversation before we started this that I didn't want to like just have on the phone, because I wanted you to bring up some of those things here.
What are your questions? I don't
Well,
know if
I guess what I would say is, in light of that, what has this conversation meant for you in terms of framing it, orienting it? What has been important for you in this? And what questions that I don't think still exist for you that you're mulling about?
I'm not sure where when you did that sort of class action suit, I think you did with a police officer. Do you remember that? How readily you were able to do something like that. I'm not sure how readily you were able to do it. So just to use that as an example in comparison. Being Mexican, I have felt very different in France, as I told you, from how I feel in the USA. I have experienced racism in USA, I remember even on a What's Left episode, I shared to you what happened to me in northern Florida, up in the more red part of the country. And I also have been in. I've stayed in Idaho. I've stayed in Boston area of Massachusetts and visited other areas of New Hampshire, and have experienced differences from outside of the cities that are normally considered more liberal, progressive places. Cities are always tend to be more diverse, but when you go outside of it, sometimes I tell people, you have to go see. The USA is pretty diverse everywhere. It's a large country, and so sometimes I don't walk through the world in the USA feeling like, oh, everyone's being racist towards me. I don't feel that way. People make more of an issue of race, I think, more than I do. When I was in college, I didn't really talk about me being Mexican. People ask me what, they want to know. And that's always the experience here. But when I was in France, and that's how I sometimes, maybe it's because I read a lot of a lot of Black authors who would discuss going to France as a safe haven. And you sometimes get this idea that French society is a more colorblind society, which isn't. Of course, it isn't. But unlike the USA, which has these ingrained Jim Crow laws from the past and the historical impact of the past, very different. And you have artists leaving to France. I could see why, because it does feel very different as a person of color there. And especially being Mexican, you don't Frida Kahlo went there, and Mexicans are celebrated differently than they are celebrated here in the USA. I think I've just become part of California was a part of Mexico, so obviously there's a lot of Mexicans here. It's just we're on the border, and I'm just another part of Mexican society here. Sometimes it feels like culture. It's part of it's very ingrained. You have burritos. You have a lot of Mexican food. Mexican food's number one top loved in the USA. But in France, it's a different phenomenon. I experience it differently. So my reservation sometimes, or I'm not going back to your experience with the class action lawsuit here, in working with others, I do see some hesitancy sometimes when we went out to the Capitol and you all left and Kenny and I stayed. It got a little bit chaotic, and there were a lot of booths talking about voting for Trump and the sentiment. And I had spoken to Trump supporters in the past. My friend is one of a very Trump supporter himself. But the rhetoric or the conversation that I would hear sometimes, even at the Capitol in Sacramento, sometimes gave me a little pause. And that's something I have to contend with. I'm not so sure if they'll be looking out for me as I'll be looking out for them. And so when I hear the hesitancy from friends in Paris, they feel that as well. It's a little hesitancy, especially the women who are joining the protests and who feel sometimes unsafe. Because sometimes when they enter these spaces, so many of these spaces are mostly men out on the streets. And the women there tend to be French, not of Arab descent. And not to say that there aren't any Arab women out there, there clearly are, but the mostly who are out in the street. So you see this contrast, and I can hear the hesitancy from my friends say, I just hope that when I'm out there, they know that I'm on their team too. You know, like we're in this together. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me of how I have felt here, you know, with people from the freedom movement, you know, and people who are Trump supporters. So that comes up for me a little bit. I understand that sexism is manifested in so many other areas of society, of course, and racism as well. When we work together, though, me as a person of color, someone who is not heteronormative or who is not heterosexual, how much are you willing to look out for? I feel that with you, Andy. You're a white person, but I don't, as you one time said, like I feel we have each other's back. I'm not so sure if the people I've met who are Trump supporters, who I would love to have their back, will have my back. Mm-hmm. I hope they do. I hope they see it in them that Trump is not their savior. Clearly, Biden isn't as well. And that our savior is us. Us. We're the people who have to save ourselves, right? That we have to come together. Yep. And maybe they idealize a Trump, and the rhetoric might push them to, like, we're working up to here, but you're not fitting with the eugenics model that I'm being taught in these other rallies or whatever, you know, or even just these parallel societies that have become more and more conservative in these suburbs of Paris. You know, it's sometimes hard. Sometimes I was talking to one French woman. She's like, it's hard for me to walk through there. I don't have a hijab. I don't wear one, and I don't follow, and I dress the way I do. And they'll probably accept me being the way that I am because I'm a French woman. And they know that I'm not going to adhere to their traditions. But I know the Arab friends that I have who are women cannot just walk by me like that. And so these are sometimes these hesitancies. So the constant conversation I think we need to have now, moving away from the criticism of voting and not depending on the state to save us, is amongst us as working class folk. We have to be united in this, and we have to have those difficult discussions ourselves, you know. So and also being Mexican, I more Western, I realize stark differences. We're more Western thought, and I see myself more with French than I do as Mexican than I do with Arabs, if that makes any sense, because in Mexico we don't wear hijabs. We're not as, like, obviously clearly there's sexism in the USA and in Mexico, of course, but the level of religious dogma and imposition is very stark. And so I have seen myself sometimes fall into this trap when I'm in a rural part of, like, I've stayed in southern Nantes, which is in a small rural village called Mouchon, and I was the only Mexican, and I didn't have any issue. I didn't have any problems there, and I stayed with a host family, and I could see myself falling almost into a trap where I did feel aligned with them in some aspect, because we share very similar values as Mexican society and French culture. So we share the values of freedom and women not being controlled by any religious tradition in that way. So I can see myself falling into that. I can clearly see it. And so the issue of integration, as you were discussing it, is one we tread around very lightly, very carefully, not lightly, carefully, I meant to say. And that's not something I feel when I'm in the USA. I don't talk about things like that. Whereas I would in France. How do we then deal with wanting revolution, staying united, but also not fall into traps of integration, which tend to divide us? So this is a reflection as I have as I'm concluding here.
Well, I think one of the ways I think you gave expression to what I think it will need to feel like if we're making headway on building a collective struggle is that thing where you said, I believe I have your back, but I don't know if you have mine. And I think that is the feeling people are going to have over and over and over again. And the answer to that is going to have to be yes. And people are going to have to, but the only way people will get that answer of yes is not because I tell you I have your back, but there's something I'm going to have to do that shows you that. And I might have to do it more than once. And so I think that was what was most helpful for me in listening in this last part is I think you expressed at the base level what these different communities are going to have to, what's going to partially divide them because they get a sense, I'm prepared to come and help you, but would you do the same for me if I was in the same? Because unless these communities do feel exactly that same way, like I'm helping you because I know you'd help me, that's going to be the important barometer of knowing we've made some headway on building an actual collective collaborative struggle, rather than something that says, here's the checklist of things you need to believe in order to come in and be part of our group. Mm-hmm. So I think that was helpful for me to hear you speak of it that way. And I also think that the thing you said of like, I noticed when you said, I noticed myself falling for that trap. We will all need to be doing that kind of internal self-reflection because we all fall for it. There are so many traps laid for us ideologically under capitalism that of course we fall into them. That's where every one of us just has to look and say, wait, does this make sense? Because it seems like these people are just kind of running their own society and yet the state is coming in on them. I'm not like that. This new or this self-run society is not one I'm comfortable with, but I see the state coming in on it. Which side are you going to take? If you find yourself taking the side of the state, then you better think twice. You better recognize you've fallen for a trap and try to get yourself out of it. Because that capitalist state and capitalist corporations, they're side by side in making this world the hell that it is. And unless we do something about it, I think, World War III and all that.
And I see the very beloved, but obviously tricked host family I stayed with do that. They will secretly share things with me that they cannot feel they can share in public, but they will vote for Macron,
Yeah.
Or many of that very same small village will vote for someone like Le Pen.
Yeah.
So it's putting your trust in one or the other, which isn't going to help you in any other way. It will have to take some difficulties and having to come into terms with like ourselves.
Yes. And our own fears that have been bred into us, either from the government or from some experience. Sometimes that's from experience. We're going to have to overcome that.
Mm-hmm. Wonder who's out there. Tom Moore would say, because I think that there are some differences in the way he thinks that this happens also in Germany.
Yeah, right.
He's clearly on the left.
Left, right? He would say, well, we need to build the left, and I don't think we need to go for that.
All right, let's conclude. Well, this was a good conversation.
Yeah.
You were on fire today, Andy, this morning. You, Saturday mornings, huh? Let's burn it together.
But productively, like, I mean, it really is sad that 2005 and 2023 look so similar. There's nothing's been accomplished in that time.
Yeah. All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests in the episode notes. Wherever you found this episode or on our blog at whatsleftpodcast.com, you can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you fancy anything you have heard, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, Odysee, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes, wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson, and we'll have Jessica on next week. You can find our social media handles as at Don Eduardo Barca and at DepTKE for Kenny on Instagram, and Jess's Twitter handle as at jhomie89. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Andy, for this conversation, and we'll check you out next time. Ciao.
Bye-bye.